There's a powerful way for recruiters to build their personal brand without creating tons of content. And my guest today is going to teach you how to do it.
Visibility creates opportunity. However you can do that, because we're in the digital age space. And so you just have to be exposed depending on what your intentions are.
That's Orlando Haynes, a recruiter and podcaster who has created the ultimate guide on how to be a great podcast guest. You heard that right. We're not talking about starting your own podcast, but how being a guest on a podcast can help boost your visibility and attract candidates, clients, and opportunities. In today's episode, we cover how to choose the right podcast to appear on, strategies for staying authentic while on air, how to handle unexpected questions like a pro, common mistakes to avoid as a podcast guest, technical considerations to ensure you sound and look your best, and how to maximize the impact of your appearance long after the recording is done. Whether you're an experienced podcast guest or considering your first appearance, this episode is packed with actionable advice to help you make the most out of your podcast appearances. Let's dive into my conversation with Orlando. Hey, Orlando, thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Rona. I appreciate it.
So, I saw the other day that you wrote a really great guide about how to be a good podcast guest. What inspired you to write it?
You know what? It's been because I've been doing it for almost 4 years now, being on this side of the seat as an interviewer, now being in the interviewee seat. It's something that I've noticed throughout multiple episodes. Plus, I've watched other podcasts that spark that journey. And I always want to make sure that whoever I have on is promoted and highlighted in the best way, right? So that's what we're doing. We're making sure we can showcase that individual, their talent, their expertise, whatever it is. And so I want to make sure they know that coming on to any podcast affords them that opportunity so they can shine. Then you talk about post-production and things like that, to where they can leverage that podcast, for marketing efforts and things like that. So if it doesn't look right, doesn't sound right, then it's a miss both for the podcast host and the guests. And so I just wanted to share a little bit basic tips to say, hey, if you're going down this journey, here are some basic fundamental things, you should look out for so you can maximize, your podcast appearances.
It's great that you mentioned how it's a journey that people want to go on. And we know in talent acquisition as recruiters, we get it. Personal branding is important. If you really want to be successful, you have to work on your personal brand. Usually for people that means, I think usually when people talk about it, they're talking about creating content. And I'm someone that says you don't necessarily have to create your own content. And I think that being a guest on a podcast is like a cheat code shortcut to building your personal brand without having to create content. How do you think being a guest on a podcast can help your personal brand?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what came to mind when you asked that is what I talk about with job seekers, right? And so I tell job seekers, hey, leverage other recruiters, or should I say leverage recruiters, reach out to a recruiter and gather 3, 4, 5, 10 people that that are looking, that are in your, in your market, in your ecosystem, that are friends, and ask that recruiter, say, hey, can you come on this, Zoom call and just share some best practices? And so a lot of recruiters don't get the tap to necessarily be on a podcast just within their market, more or less, bigger podcast to get some recognition. But the value in being a guest is that you can share your brand but there's two sides to it, right? So I look at it as a podcaster that when I have guests on, I'm creating multiple marketing, members of my team. So I've done over 140 episodes right now. So that's 140 individual marketers that can promote that episode, if it was a good quality episode. And then on the reverse, I can talk to all the things that I've learned throughout that journey, who I spoke to, and things like that, but also leverage my experience in that. So I think what I call it is called VCO. It's just visibility creates opportunity. However you can do that, because we're in the digital age space. And there's a great book by Gary Vee calling Day Trade Attention that a lot of people are grabbing at. And that's what he talks about, how to be visible everywhere to maximize sales, opportunities, etc. It's because we're in this social media age. And so you just have to be exposed depending on what your intentions are. Don't do it just to do it, but if you're doing with an intention to grow so you can create opportunities, you can. And I always look at it too that job seekers can leverage business practices for their career when it comes to the marketing. So they can choose to create content or, like you said, get on podcasts and share, vlog their own journey, things like that. It doesn't have to be extensive. You don't have to pull all the triggers, but it does help because you're creating eyeballs to your LinkedIn profile that can thus result in a snowball effect for you to get opportunities.
And I love that VCO, visibility creates opportunity, because it's true. And as recruiters, you're competing, especially in a market like this one, you're competing. Yes, there's a lot more jobs than job seekers right now, but that doesn't mean that people are just taking any job or working with any recruiter type of thing. So visibility is good. Attention is good for attracting opportunities and candidates and all of that. But how do you determine which podcasts are a good fit for your expertise and for your target audience and your brand goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would only look at ones that are in the same ecosystem as me. It's funny. I used to didn't think that way because I used to think, hey, more exposure is more exposure, but it doesn't. Your message won't land with the wrong audience, and at that point, you've just wasted, 45 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour of your time and the host time to jump on that podcast. So there was one opportunity that I got to, it wasn't a podcast, but it was a virtual speaking opportunity with $1 billion financial company here in Florida. But I'm thinking it was about career stuff, but it slightly was. It was around African Americans in corporate America. And so I was like, okay, it was Black History Month. And so they funded that opportunity. I was like, okay, how much, what's my angle? What can I share in this space? It wound up being good because I was able to give my journey, my experience, through being in corporate for 20 plus years. And so there's different folks on there. But when I look at where I'm going to plant my message, who I'm going to partner with, and I also think about it, does my brand fit that brand? Even when I request guests, I want to make sure that I'm asking them, does this fit your brand? I can clearly see there's a synergy, but I want to make sure they see it too before they just raise their hand to come on. And I've rejected folks who were just not in the same space. I'm not going to talk about things that don't resonate with me or don't fit my beliefs. One company reached out, they did cannabis. I was like, I'm not going to have you on talking about cannabis. That's not, you're right. That's my belief. I don't partake. So there's no need for us to meet, but it has to be in that same career development ecosystem. And there's so many multi-layers, as you know, as well, Rona, that I don't want to necessarily pigeonhole to say my only message is, personal branding, like we share that in common, but it's talent acquisition, it's recruiting, it's all the other ancillary things that come with it, resumes, et cetera. I can share a level of expertise in that. So if it fits again in that ecosystem, I'm able to say yes. I necessarily don't care what the audience level is, how large it is, but I do want to know that the messaging is adding value. If it's just to have a conversation and there's no direct to actually help people, that's not a fit for me. I need to know that I'm going to help people anytime I open my mouth on my own podcast or anyone else's.
You've said some really good things, and it's so important. First, you really have to know your goals and what your real goal is with your personal brand. And that really helps you be like, okay, no, this isn't aligned or this is aligned. The other thing that you mentioned is something that I see people fall into that trap. It's like, well, I don't want to be on that podcast because it's new, or I don't know how many listeners they have. I see it more as long as I'm aligned with what the podcast is about, as long as it's aligned with my goals, I don't really care how many people listen to it, because I'm going to use that content too. And I'm going to share. I know my audience. I know how many people I have. So it's a mutually beneficial thing, because maybe I help the podcast host get more eyeballs on their podcast. I know people with way larger audiences than mine have come on my podcast, and that has helped. But also people that are in my audience who, because I mean, you can be a large creator, but you don't necessarily have everyone's eyeballs. So
Hmm.
people from my smaller audience have been like, oh, I didn't know about this person and about their expertise. So really, it's all about your goals and how it aligns with your personal brand. And metrics like that, like size and things like that, aren't really the best thing. What about people that, unlike us? So yes, we are in talent acquisition, and you, for example, also do career coaching for job seekers. I work specifically, yeah, with talent acquisition and HR people. But what about recruiters who are recruiting, I don't know, let's say in the trucking industry, for
Hmm.
example? What type of podcast do you think, or how can they determine what type of podcast would be aligned with their brand?
Yeah, I don't think for them if they should look at just super niche, because again, let's take the trucking industry as you said. You got to think how many truck drivers listen to career related podcasts, and then there's a separator. Are they creating a podcast from the business? So they're talking about industry specific stuff, policies, what's happening in the market, what the shift is. Because I worked for a company which was heavy logistics and had drivers. And so those conversations I was a part of, and we knew how many drivers were leaving the market, like literally hundreds of thousands by 2020 and 2021. So we had that data. And so that's something they could have shared on a podcast to just say, okay, hey, we're a source of information in this logistics and transportation industry. Here's why you should listen to us. If a recruiter targeting candidates, then it's a little more specific and different in their communication, at least from my opinion. I think they can share more stuff about the culture, the opportunity. Here's what's going on. Also some data around the industry. So it's a bit of a mix, and just so they can, data mine folks and get some, build their talent pipeline. And so that communication is a bit different. I think they can still go broad versus going super, super narrow, because you may just lose the audience. And you also got to think, at least the way I do, it's not so much if I can hit the first person, because that first person may not be my audience, but they may know someone and they may know someone. So creating that trickle effect, that snowball effect in my communications, they may say, hey, Rona, I just heard this podcast about trucking over at this company called FedEx, right? Doesn't your brother have a CDL license and things like that? Hey, I think he should check it out. They sound like they're hiring, etc. But I'm in finance, but I know you, and I happen to know your brother is in it. So there's that trickle effect that can happen as long as the information, I think, is relevant enough to an audience. Now, I would have listened if I would have listened and it was specific around, hey, here are the numbers that's happening in the market, and nothing was said about hiring opportunities. I would have bypassed it. I'd be like, I don't know anything. I don't care about that. I'm skipping it. They're talking about hiring. It just so happens to be in the transportation and logistics, industry. So I think recruiters who are looking to do that, if they're corporate recruiters, and also I can share later on about what an agency recruiter would talk about, then there is a little bit of a mix, because there's a difference between those two types of recruiters.
What's the difference? What would an agency recruiter talk about in this example?
Yeah, so I would think there's a great opportunity for that agency recruiter to share personal stuff and their expertise, because they're going to say, "Hey, I specialize in accounting and finance. I work in these markets, California, Nevada, et cetera, and I only focus on director level and above. And here are the types of roles I look for." CFOs, senior finance analysts, directors of finance, accounting, comptrollers, controllers, etc. And so they can then highlight where their level of expertise to hopefully draw the right attention to the folks. And there's different ways you can do it. When Clubhouse, if you remember Clubhouse, when it came out, there was large tech companies that were hosting, talks about the organization, and that was their way to create talent pipeline. Well, we have LinkedIn Audio now. Why not do the same thing, right? If you have a massive hiring need, why not the organization reach out and saying, hey, if you're an agency recruiter, I work for 3 large companies in the area, whether they're big 4 or not in accounting or whatever it is in that area. Here's what I'm going to be sharing. Make the post, make it 30 minutes or an hour, and just speak to what the opportunities are. And then what you can do from there, it's just another way of talent pipeline creation, but it also helps their personal brand because they'll know, hey, Rona does this every 3 weeks or once a month, strictly around accounting and finance positions, director and above. I'm that candidate. I need to know what she's talking about. And so, again, you share the opportunities, you share your expertise, share market relevancy. And so now you're creating this belief and perception around you, which it should be true, that you're the go-to person in that market for these types of roles. And that's a standout thing versus the traditional model. And unfortunately, staffing and recruiting staffing agencies, that model is broken. It's been the same for, 40 plus years. And so I think they desire a mix up, and you work with folks like that. So they need that mix up and how to create more or less a small media company to build their personal brands, build the brand of the company, but become expertise, their thought leadership, etc., so they can attract the right system. And now that creates multiple talent pipelines versus just letting them apply to the ATS, right?
Yeah. So, okay, now listeners are aware of their goals. They know which podcast to target. What's your approach, or what approach do you recommend to pitching yourself as a guest on a podcast?
You know what? I rarely do. So I rarely pitch myself. I've been lucky enough to have been asked for a few times. And plus, I've been so focused on growing my podcast. And so when I do this, again, I think I'll just reverse engineer. My earlier answer was, yeah, does it align? And I actually built out a list of podcasts in the space that I'm going to start pitching to. So it's not like I'm not going to do it. I have it, but I've just been so focused so I can capture, some great talent and share some expert advice and create additional opportunities for myself as well. But at the same time, I said, you know what, now's a good time. I've been doing it 4 years. It's getting a little visibility. It's heard across, 16 countries. Great. And so how do I leverage that to then say, hey, when you partner with me as a guest, here's what I'm also bringing to the table. So I wanted to build up some equity on that, aside from 20 plus years, talent acquisition, author, speaker, et cetera, which I think a lot of us are doing. But for us, folks like us who have that duality background in a podcast, while also bringing expertise, quote unquote, expertise, and then an audience with us. So I think there's more weight, gravitas, and, exposure to that to say, hey, I'm not just tapping into yours. I'm bringing my audience to you as well. So it's definitely going to be beneficial. And so that's what I wanted to do. And that's how I'm going to package it all, not just my experience, but also the podcast, weight and leverage and reach of that. So hopefully that helps to expose me to more podcasts. And again, it has to be in that ecosystem.
Yeah. So both of us have podcasts and we have an audience that we've been working on for years. A lot of the folks that are listening don't have a huge audience or don't really do a lot as far as their personal branding. So let's kind of reverse engineer this. How do you go about figuring out who you should invite to your podcast?
Yeah, great question. Yep, great question. So it doesn't matter to me. So I do a lot of my searching on LinkedIn. All right, that's the best platform in my estimation. And so I don't look at whether you have 10,000 followers, 50, 100 plus. It doesn't matter. I look at the content because I want to see what the messaging is and are you adding value? So my tagline for Career Talks podcast is providing actionable advice for your career and life. And so when I talk to guests, my goal for every single episode, Rona, is that someone listening can say, when I had you in mind a few years back, is that what she said makes sense. I'm going to apply it today, and I should start seeing a difference in my job search efforts or interview or my, growth to getting hired, et cetera. Whatever the topic is, they need to at least walk away with one golden nugget from each episode that they can apply immediately. And for me, it's about taking massive action. So immediate massive action, which Tony Robbins talks about a lot. And so, or imperfect action, or commit first, figure out the rest later, right? It's so just really centered around that. And so when I look at a potential guest, it's what are they saying? What are they sharing? Is it antiquated information? Is it up to date? Because if it's antiquated, I don't need that. If it's up to date, if it's different angle, I want to hear it. And so then that's what makes me reach out. Again, I can care less, how big their following is. It doesn't matter. It's the messaging, because I'm thinking about the listener first to extract one nugget and go apply it.
Yeah, it's very similar to my approach. And as you said, I have been on a few podcasts. I lost count now. I've never actually pitched myself. I think I pitched myself once to a live show many years ago. Kamara Toffolo, who's actually full circle going to be on my show soon. Yep. I pitched myself to her way back when, and that's the only time I've ever pitched myself for a podcast. Every other time it's been the host that has reached out. But it's been because, hey, I saw your post about this, or I was in their comments, they posted something and I commented something and they're like, I like that your approach. Let's talk about it more. Do you want to come on my podcast? Mm-hmm. So indirect pitching might be a way. And for recruiters, this is easy. You're already doing it. You're already networking, or should be, out there creating any type of small types of content, or in the comments that could lead to podcast interviews requests.
So I would also share, I've been lucky enough now that I necessarily don't have to reach out, only because I get pitched a lot of folks from companies that specialize in getting you on podcast. And so if I were to accept, 5% of those, that would book me out quite a bit. But there's folks that for some reason, I'm just, enamored by LinkedIn. So I stay on that platform because I can see the content. It's easier for me to see it versus gets pitched, and then I have to go look. And some, if their talking points don't align, then no, but I've been blessed that way. And one of my secrets of staying consistent is just making sure I book 3-4 months in advance of guests. So again, it's that commit first, figure out the rest later.
Yeah. What's the best pitch that you've got from a guest that isn't a PR company? So we know they're experts, but someone just in their house wants to be on your podcast. What's the best one? Do you remember it?
I don't know if I got a great pitch, because they do come at least every week. I couldn't say it's not a high frequency from LinkedIn, but it's enough to where, again, I can book. But I don't think anyone necessarily stood out, because I'm always going to look at their content. But there's additional ways that I find is if it's an audio event, whatever event, and like you just mentioned, right, in the comments. And that's why it's so key to have your LinkedIn profile optimized and that header stand out. I can see exactly what they do. The first sentence is career coach or grief coach or the whatever coach. And I'm like, oh, okay, executive coach. Let me just quickly see. Then I quickly go to what's their activity on the profile or on the platform. So I just want to make sure that they're active. Now, if they can have this grand old title and beautiful headshot and beautiful banner, but if there's no activity, I'm like, all they have is a profile. They don't have a presence. I do need people who have at least a presence, like they're actively posting, putting out content. It doesn't, again, the following doesn't matter, but they're engaging and sharing in that information. So, but no slam dunk, whoa pitch that came my way that I can recall. I've been lucky to have some pretty, I guess if you follow them, high profile people that are in our ecosystem of career development, Wall Street Journal bestsellers, New York Times bestselling authors, international speakers as well, that are actively on the platform and literally travel around the world speaking. And so been lucky to have those folks, join the podcast early on. I had zero following, no kind of podcast, acumen, et cetera. But they're willing to always come back and share some information. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, the main takeaway is, like you said, have a presence, not just a profile, because as a podcast host, it's also a big risk that you're taking if you invite someone on your podcast that you know nothing about. There's no content, you don't know what they really think. It's like, that's a huge risk.
Yeah.
I know I'm not willing to take a risk to invite someone who I know absolutely nothing about and find out during a recording.
Yeah.
That's not something I'm going to do.
No, and I do mine live, so that's even the second layer. So I do the live try to capture that audience, then repurpose it on audio, etc. But yeah, I would never take that risk. And they say something completely off whack or inappropriate, and I want to make sure no one's using foul language, etc. And so that would be a high risk. And I always thought that, like, what would I do? Would I just kill the broadcast right in the middle of it? So I say, you know what? To avoid all that, let me fact check who these people are and, do the intro before the go live date and talk through logistics.
Exactly. So, all right, let's say you've pitched yourself, you are going to be a guest on a podcast. What's your go-to strategy to prep when you're invited as a guest on a podcast?
Yeah, so it depends on the topic. Well, my strategy would be the same. So the topic may require me to do a little more research than anything else. As a podcaster, we all have different styles and approaches. I'm more of a free-flowing person, so I personally don't give the guest any upfront questions. And if it's given to me, that's fine. That all works because it's still a conversation, right? Anything can happen in a free-flowing conversation. So it all depends on who the audience is too, right? Because you try to be authentic as much as you can, but there's still a level of, okay, this is a little more audience that's a little more, for lack of a better term, more prestige or stuffy. So you may not can be your full self because it just won't land. Right. There's certain jokes for a comedian won't land in a certain audience. So you have to tailor it. So you have to know more about the audience. Who is it for? What's the community like? What's their pain point? So I can speak directly to it again, so they can walk away with actionable advice. And then, I do the research and I'll practice. I'll put some slides together if just for myself, but then I'll make sure in my head, I'm going over talking points and knowing what I want to bring up specifically in the discussion, and also what points I want to harp on. Right, we've given talks and presentations, and so there's certain parts of it you want to emphasize. So I walk through the mechanics of that, but by no means am I a speaker coach. But things that I've learned, I'm sure you've learned as well, Rona, through our experience, is that you want to be able to get I think of the end goal in mind is, okay, again, when I finish, you should be able to take something I've said, if not 1, 2, or 3 things, and immediately apply it. And I would always love to hear the feedback. Oh, it was this, it was that. And the funny part is, whether it's a podcast or live, I kind of approach those the same. It's always you really don't know if it's landing, even if they're laughing with you and things like that, until someone comes up and says, hey, Rona, what you said about this in the personal branding piece, oh my God, that was incredible. I know what to do now. I can't wait to apply it on X. And that's why I'm like, okay, it worked. Okay. It was okay. At least one person said something.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's all you can do. You can really research. And I love that you talked about the audience because, lots of people focus on researching the host. That's cool and everything. But you're there, hopefully, so that the listeners of this podcast can learn something. So researching who they are and tailoring your prep to them and their pain points is really a great way to prepare for a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how can you make sure that you stay authentic to yourself, your brand message, and your goals after you've prepared, you know everything about the audience or as much as you can? How do you make sure that you stay authentic in your answers?
Yeah, that's true. So I would never take on an opportunity that I'm not versed in. So even they can, because you can get asked, hey, you got to, and for the folks who may look at it, Rona has a big brand. She's doing this. She should be able to talk about this. Orlando does this. He should be able to talk about that. Well, not exactly. If you've done the research or looked on our websites or even just looked, at our profiles, we don't specialize in that. So in my corporate job, part of the role I do is in the D&I space, but I would necessarily never go on a panel as a D&I expert. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'll get eaten alive, right? And so I would never position myself into that, even though it's in the career ecosystem. I would never take that leap and say, hey, yes, diversity, inclusion, equity, all the different titles or letters that's attached to it now. Unfortunately, it's being dismantled, but I would never take that chance. Now, the specialties that I talked about earlier, that's what I would do. I'll stay in my lane. I'll stay in my lane and focus. Being authentic, my personality is going to come across. I know my voice I'm conscious of that. It's monotone. So I have to be conscious of how I relay that. How do I lift my tone? And it's funny when I always hear it back, it still sounds the same. I'm like, oh my God, I can't do nothing. So, so I'm aware of that. My hand gestures, my facial expressions, not to, create a false narrative of who I am, but it may be something I'm saying that you can see the increase in passion. It's like, oh, he's really talking about this one right here. He's going a little bit deep, or maybe long-winded, like I feel I am now. But it's those moments that I think about and just saying, hey, I'm gonna tell you who I am. I'm not going to give you this gravitas of 20 years and all this, and you can read about that. You asked me to be here to speak about something. Let me impact your audience again, so they can walk away something actionable. And so that's what I think about with being authentic is, who am I helping at the end of that message, talk, podcast, conversation, etc.
How do you make sure for, like, okay, let's say folks are going to do this is they're going to be their personal branding strategy, they're going to be on podcast.
Mm-hmm.
How can they make sure that their message is coming across consistently over different podcasts, right?
So I think about that in terms of an actor, or a Broadway actor, or a comedian. Right. So a comedian who goes on tour will tell the same jokes with a slight twist night after night after night. Right. So they have to master their first set, whatever that set is, and then tweak it per audience to make it funnier, or to fit that audience and to make it funnier. So for us as folks who take on speaking opportunities, we should, I think in my head, right, apply that same principle. Is you're going to change it a little bit here and there, but stay on message. Like, yes, it can get boring repeating yourself, but that's the goal, because you go on one podcast, that's not every podcast. You may capture 10 people. If your goal is to capture 1 million, you better keep saying that message over and over and over. And if, like, you see actors go on a promotional tour, they're being asked probably the same 10 questions over and over and over. So they have to repeat that same messaging, right? Just so more people will hear it, it resonates. And that's how, really, from an external looking in, your brand is building. And that's where you're changing the narrative, and you're being known for X. Rona is known for X. Orlando is known for X, because I heard it in Amsterdam, I heard it in Germany, I heard it in the US and California and Florida, etc. But if you've only told it once thinking it's going to land for the masses, you're wrong. So be comfortable, be able to say that same, whatever that topic is, have your core several topics that you can speak to. But yeah, there'll be some variance, because over time things change. So you have to tweak and update the data. But I think that will be the best way to look at it, because repetition is what makes it better. And then that what communicates to the masses. You just have to continue to say the same thing over and over.
Yeah, I always say, and I've said it in a few episodes before, when you're bored of saying the same thing, that's when you know you're doing great.
That's good. Yep.
because you've said it so many times. It's now like second nature, just rolls off your tongue type
Yeah.
of thing. It's like, you know it, it's your thing. That's when you can be like, okay, that's when people start making that association of Orlando is the person for this, Rona is the person for this.
Yep.
That's when you start building your brand, when you've repeated it over and over and over again.
Yep.
So, how do you handle unexpected questions? Like in the middle of a podcast, some people, like you said, give you questions ahead of time and stick to those. Some people, like me, give you like themes and questions and hardly ever stick to them. And some
Which is great. It's great. I love it.
some people don't give you a guide at all, just a main topic. So, how do you handle unexpected questions that arise during an interview?
So I think that's the beauty of it, right? And to your earlier question about being authentic, if I don't know, I'm gonna tell you, great question. I don't know, Rona. What are your thoughts? Let's, we can mastermind this like right now and figure out. I can give you my opinion. I won't be able to back it up with any facts if I don't know about it, but I don't mind the curveball. I think for most of us, we can think pretty good on our feet. And so I'm okay with, again, the curveball, a screwball, fastball that wasn't preset. And it's a challenge. And that makes me mentally get faster in my thinking to say, okay, well, maybe I do know something. It was just so deep, I just didn't recognize it. So that question sparked it. But and then it's like, oh, you know what? I may not know this, but here's someone who does, and let me just share a little bit about what I've heard. Don't take it as Bible. I'm just sharing my tidbit. But yeah, if I don't know, I'm not going to profess to know to try to seem like an expert. And then that's where it all comes crumbling down. And then you're a fraud, you're this, and that's not my brand.
Great, great advice. And I take a similar approach. I just say something like, well, anecdotally,
Mm-hmm.
or this is what I think. Like, if I don't have, I've been on shows where people ask me things and I'm like, I mean, I know of this because of my experience, for example, as a
Yep.
job seeker. Not, I haven't worked in this side of talent acquisition, so I definitely don't know this type of thing. So it's like there's always some sort of way you can get to it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, being honest is the most important part. So, what are some common mistakes that you've seen people make as podcast guests, and what do you recommend they do to avoid them?
Yeah, how much time we got? So, one of the things that also sparked me to put out that ebook, what is it called? 10 Steps to Maximize Your Podcast Appearances, is that the same. I would say, if you're able to. So if you're a coach, a business person, whatever it is, if your goal is to say, okay, I'm going to get more exposure by getting on podcasts, so you have to be mindful of, think about every tool that the podcaster host is using. You need, not to the same level or degree, but you need the basics, right? The good mic, good camera. If you're using your iPhone, that's great, whatever, high quality, everything from how close you are up to the camera. So you're filling the frame. And I've learned this because I had a woman on my podcast who was a news reporter, and she was an Emmy Award news reporter. And so she literally gave me a class right in that discussion. Hey, we noticed that I can tell that you have an above light because it's shining on your head. You should be about 3 inches from the top of the frame, filling it out as much as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So I learned these different tactics throughout my journey. And so I just wanted to share that. But yes, you need to make sure audio is probably the number one thing, because you'll find out, and I might have put that in the ebook, people will listen to a podcast with bad visual versus listen to a podcast with bad audio and great visual. So the goal is you want them to listen because there's so many ways you can hear it. And so with that, they need to make sure the audio is number one. If you're going live, be super, super clear, be up close and personal. I did have a guest that was way, way back, and it just didn't look right. It was so unbalanced. I was like, can you pull this up closer? And that person was just like, no, it's fine. It should be able to rock and roll. The audio was bad. It was echoey. I was like, I don't think I pushed it out. I might have, but I didn't do any post edits and, promote clips because it just didn't look good. And so I wanted to make sure that as I evolve as a podcaster, the quality of the stuff looks good. Plus, they, again, like we talked about earlier, the guest can use it. And to this day, that person is still doing the same thing. And I'm just like, oh my God. And that person commented and got my ebook. And I'm like, you didn't take note though. You got the ebook, but you're still, the content that person was sharing is good advice. But just visually, aesthetically, it didn't look good. I'm like, and so that's just to help both you and the guest, be able to use that as marketing going forward, because people, you look at it, maybe a company wants to partner with you, but they see it just aesthetically doesn't fit their brand. They're like, maybe not. Content is great,
Yeah.
but we may not want to have you on as a visual guest.
And some of the things that you've said are like crucial. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, a good camera and all of that is important, but how you frame yourself
Yep.
is super important. Some people do this thing where they're like, there's this ton of headspace, then it looks like you look this tiny. It doesn't inspire authority or anything, right?
Nope.
Because it's like, okay, this tiny person. And then there's people who are like so up close and personal, like right here in your face. And I just did a no. I like covered my face as I'm talking, but like you're so up close that it's then like intimidating, or like put your camera above you. So all of these things are important. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of hosts give you those guidelines. So I'm going to say something. Yes, audio is important, super important. That's the most important part. Video and how you frame yourself and like the lighting, basic lighting is important. The most important thing really is being in communication with your host,
Yeah.
asking them for these tips. A lot of hosts have these tips already in your invites. Like I have it right after you schedule, you go to a page with my tips and what to expect. I expect guests to read that and do those basic things, because it's like no one's telling you go out and buy a $300 microphone or anything like that.
Nope.
But one that works clearly and you can get crisp audio, that's the most important thing.
I would even encourage them to, right, this particular mic look like we both have Yetis that are less than 100. There's some that are less than 100 that still work fine. So again, if you're going to go on this journey, folks, at least the mic minimum, then the secondary is definitely the visual, and just apply every tip that Rona and I are sharing, because it's your brand, right? It's your brand. It's almost like getting dressed up but your shoes are dirty. It's like, you were almost there. You were almost a great package, but we just need to make these slight tweaks, put a little shine, better shoelaces or whatever. And then it'll look better when you use that as a marketing tool. So just be mindful of that for sure.
Your guide mentioned something that I loved, which is analyzing and learning from each appearance. Like, what's a key lesson that you've learned from this self analysis that has helped you improve as a podcast guest and host?
Yeah, for me in particular, which is some of the things I look at, is I still make mistakes, right? We're human. I still make mistakes with the audio. If my mic is not connected correctly, I don't hear it until after I do the pre-check. But then after we're up and running and I check it, I'm like, oh my God, it sounds like I'm way in the back. My mic didn't connect correctly. And so I'm like, okay, be conscious of that. Two is the cadence in which I speak. Sometimes I'll talk too fast. I have a lisp, it'll jumble the words. And so I have to be mindful. Hey, slow down, be clear, stay looking at the camera. My eyes tend to wander a lot. And so I want to make sure, again, I'm connecting. And so I have to be mindful of that in between questions, in between, thoughts, and making sure I'm coming across clear posture, everything little by little. I'm going back to my natural state versus, okay, let me sit up. How close am I to the mic, etc. So all these different things are just racing through my head. And it was funny, Rhoda, I hate listening to my own podcast. And so when I do that, I'm more or less listening for the sound. And then I hear myself, if I'm trying to make a point and it's not coming across clear, I'm like, okay, I got to do better. I got to slow down. I got to think more clearly, because I'll get excited. And it's like I said, I'll stumble across my words. So I'm just like, okay, let's calm down, be mindful. And so I'm trying to be more mindful again, on how I verbally communicate, because that's the key with a podcast, right? It can be on YouTube, it can be wherever you want to listen to it. And the main thing is it coming through clear for the audience to resonate with it? So those are some of the things that I look for and try to get better with each podcast. You can be nervous, okay with my nerves, but it's still like you just never know. You just never know. Anything can happen. You're like, oh my God, I gotta be ready for this. Yeah. So it's an evolution.
Yeah, it's never gonna end. I have a checklist for when I'm a guest, and I have a checklist for when I'm a host.
Mm.
And this checklist has grown as I don't like listening to my own episodes, but when I first started, I used to edit them myself. So I was forced to listen to them. And now I don't edit my own episodes, but still anything that's going to have my name attached to it when I release it, I need to make sure. And I love the team that I work with and I trust them, but I still listen to every single episode because my name is attached to it. So I'm forced to listen to it. And then it's like, okay, I should have done this, adding this to the checklist next time to make sure whatever just happened. So yeah, it's evolving, but you get better the more you do it, but you do have to analyze your appearances and what you've done.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's perfect unless, you're talking about, the Gary V's of the world. And, those folks have such a freedom, I guess, because they, at that point, financially, they're good. If it crumbles, they're going to be fine, right? So there's a certain freedom that comes with, if you've learned yourself and fully confident in your abilities, great. Then there's that aspect of, hey, I'm at a point where I can care less what anybody says. It's not going to impact my life. And so once you reach that, I think you get more comfortable no matter how you come across on a podcast, but you're still conscious, because if you're someone who cares about the end result of what your message is, and you're still conscious about it. So he's one of the people that I look at a lot. He definitely, for my liking, too much cursing, but he gets his point across with absolute clarity, passion, and he's always thinking about the listener and saying, "Hey, this is take it or leave it. This is what I'm seeing, but take action."
Great points. So we've mentioned on it throughout the conversation, but after the recording, right? What steps do you take to make sure that your appearance as a guest continues to work for your brand?
Yeah. So if after that, how the guest or how the host works, should I say, if providing the assets or any clips or things like that, or the full episode, my goal is to leverage it now, thinking as a podcaster, how can I push this out to as many people in an email, newsletter, whatever that is, to promote, the best parts, right? The parts where, like you see on YouTube, right? They'll clip a dramatic part, put it to the beginning and start the whole podcast, which is a capture. So how do I capture the audience in one of those clips as well? And so I'll put that on I'll note that in my speaker one sheet. I've been on this podcast. Because that builds credibility, right? And so that helps you land more opportunities, like we talked about earlier, when you pitch yourself, because you've been on multiple platforms. It's just that much easier. So when you stack up a bunch of things and saying, hey, I'm presenting a 3-tier cake versus a sheet, a 1-tier cake, it's a lot more tastier and, aesthetically looking like, oh, this person, he or she brings a lot to the table. They have this going for them, this going for them, this going for them. And so that just helps you as the guest to self-promote, self-market, to create more opportunities. But again, for me in particular, I'm like, is the value there? Did I land? If I totally bombed the interview, I'm not going to use it. I don't want to, and I'll apologize. I'm like, hey, that was that was completely awful. My apologies. If you want to run it back, great. If not, I get it. But it's how can I, again, and I'll beat a dead horse, is how can I add value to that listener? So my goal is to leverage the marketing of all that post-production stuff.
Yeah, and the cool thing about 2024 and AI and how it's evolved, because as someone who started being a guest on podcast before some of these tools existed, the cool thing is now, even if the guest doesn't give you the little short clips or assets, if they put it on YouTube or pretty much anywhere, you can use tools, and I'll link my 2 favorite ones in the show notes, but you can use tools where all you do is drop the link of the
Mm-hmm.
YouTube, and then the tool goes and clips the best moments, and you can edit it and like do like just share that on social media.
Yep.
As a host, I like to share with my guest the assets because I just do. I think if someone spent the time to come to your podcast, you should share the assets, and also it's a way to make sure that people are sharing the parts of the interview that I think were good, and all of that stuff. But if I'm also not opposed to people doing their own clips and stuff like that. So if you happen to be a guest on a podcast that doesn't have like big post production and doesn't do clips and stuff, you can always get them yourself. And that's
Yep.
the beauty of AI and where we are right now.
Yeah. Plus, right, it's a mutual beneficial exchange, because the people who see the clip are like, I absolutely want to see more. I have to go to the host podcast. I'm not going to the guest podcast because it's not on that platform. It's on the host platform. So I need to go find out who Rona is, see her information, listen to one. Oh no, now I'm listening to three. Oh wow, yeah, I'm subscribing. Now, oh, she got a YouTube. Oh, she coaches. Oh, yep. So right, it's that trickle effect that you get to see everything that person does. And like we said, the AI is incredible now. That one clip can have such an impact. You never know. That's why YouTube Shorts were so big, and IG, the clips were so big at one point. And I think that's shifting in the market. It's now more long form that people are tuning into more. And then obviously on the back end, we're chopping it up. But it's a mutual beneficial exchange especially when it's a good episode, and you're like, yeah, definitely got to push this out. This is really good.
Yeah, and for us that are on LinkedIn, especially us in TA, I think most of us are on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is really putting their money behind video and clips. So ride the wave.
I know.
That's why
So I definitely got to double down on that for sure.
So this has been an amazing conversation. I'm so sure that listeners are going to get so much value out of this conversation. How can listeners connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again, Rona, for the opportunity. Glad we were able to pod swap. If you're a podcaster, you know the terminology. And so they can connect with me right on LinkedIn, Orlando Haynes. Also go to my website, careertalkspodcast.com, and then you'll see the links for all the podcasts, Apple, Spotify, etc. If you want coaching, etc., you'll see all that information on the podcast. But I'm on LinkedIn every day, so that's probably the primary space. But you'll see all my contact information as well on the careertalkspodcast.com website.
Perfect. And I'll link all of that in the show notes, and also the link to Orlando's guide of the 10 steps to be a great podcast guest. It's an amazing guide, and I really encourage everyone to get it. And there you have it, folks. Visibility creates opportunity. But you don't have to spend hours creating content to be visible and have a strong personal brand. Thanks to Orlando for sharing his insights. Don't forget to grab his free guide on how to be a great podcast guest. The link is in the show notes. And if you want help creating content to expand on any of your guest appearances, let's chat. I've launched a new done-for-you service where you spend 1 hour with me and I create a month's worth of short-form videos for you. It's that easy. Learn more at throwoutttheplaybook.com/video. The link is in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe. Next week, I'll share very simple ways you can repurpose content from podcast guest appearances. You don't want to miss that episode.